Я не знал.
Alright, so maybe I should speak first just for a couple of minutes and first of all introduce Mark Lipovetsky if anyone doesn't know him yet. Not only is he a long-time colleague and a fellow professor at Columbia University, he is also a friend and of course a supporter of Tamizdat project in many ways, in spirit and otherwise. And I am in a very unusual role here. For myself, I usually announce other people's events, and here I am sitting behind a book of mine that just got published by Cornell University Press in 2023, obviously this year, a month ago or so. Before Mark starts interrogating me about the book, I just want to mention that this event is part of Tamizdat Project Summer School that we started 2 weeks ago, with all these wonderful people sitting mainly in the front rows, but also over there at the table. It's been sheer delight, but also a very intense experience. We kind of got it rolling, and we have big plans. And also to break the news, we just received a grant for the summer school that only means that it's going on for all 3 months until the very end of the summer. For the worse or for the better. So it is of course an extension what we are doing today these weeks, this summer, of what Tamizdat project became officially last year when it became a non-profit organization, having grown out of a research project that we are going to talk more about today, of course. But this transformation of Tamizdat project into a non-profit kind of has opened many new directions for us, including those beautiful things that Diana Gore has been designing, our designer. Also including the library that we are gradually collecting, and even today we just received a wonderful book from one of the visitors. Thank you very much. So this is going to be a catalog. We are upgrading the website, and one of us is working on this with the programmer, Pavel. So stay tuned, we will be posting updates. We also go to archives, libraries locally. We've been to YPL, we've been to Princeton, we've been to the Bachmetiev archive at Columbia. Our next one is Beinecke Library at Yale, and so on. So this is just an introduction. Thank you all the Tamizdat project participants for making it happen. Thank you for coming to listen to Mark and myself and talk about Tamizdat. Thank you.
All right, so now it's my turn, and which makes my role quite peculiar. So I have to introduce the host, so if somebody by any accident doesn't know Yasha Klots, he is the author of this wonderful book that we are going to discuss today and talk about the phenomenon that he is describing in that book. He has received his PhD at Yale, and that's basically your fourth book, right? So Brodsky, Lithuania was the first one. Then there was a book of interviews poets in New York, published by the NLO publishing house in Moscow. And then there was a translation of Tamara Petkevich's memoir, very important book as well. And so this, those of you who are familiar with the academic practices, typically the person writes a dissertation and then turns the dissertation into a book. But Yasha's trajectory is much more complicated, and as far as I understand, this book has nothing to do with your dissertation. Right? It's a completely new project, and as you can see, this is one of projects that becomes a seed for greater events, and this foundation and the auction and many other things that Yasha is doing are sort of growing from this book, and it is very. I think so. Of course, we're all moving towards electronic books and written by AI and probably read by AI. But
This one was not written by AI.
no. We have a living proof of the fact that it was not written by AI, and hopefully will not be read by AI. But what I'm trying to say is that the material presence of the book is still a landmark in life of the author, not only the author. So I think that this book is very significant for our field because, believe it or not, although everybody knows the word Tamizdat, right, and sort of it doesn't need translation in any language, right? Less people know the word Tamizdat, but we always can explain its meaning. But there was no book about Tamizdat. There were collections of articles that were tackling Tamizdat issues. There are various forms of scholarship about particular works that were published in Tamizdat. But the book about Tamizdat as the cultural institution is this one. That's the first and foundational book, and I'm absolutely confident that anybody who will be writing about these issues, and I'm pretty sure that these issues will remain relevant for a long time, that they will have to cite Yasha's book from now on, because it is indeed a foundational book, and of course you can read it and buy it, I don't know, take it in the library or download. I think it's available as all Cornell books. It's available in the e-form as well. So it is the book that, on the one hand, in the introduction, gives a very important overview of the concept of Tamizdat, of the books and texts published abroad when they cannot be published in their native sort of country, and certainly Yasha is writing about Russian Tamizdat and begins its history from Herzen, but then sort of traces it over the 1920s. The important pages are dedicated to the huge scandal that broke around publications of Evgeny Zamyatin's We and Pilnyak's Mahogany in 1929, which is sort of a landmark again for Tamizdat history. Then there is a brief but also very important subchapter, I would say, in the introduction about Ardis that became some kind of the sort of hub of Tamizdat in the 70s and 80s. And then there are chapters, each of which is sort of, I would say it's a novella or maybe a concise novel, because it tells the story of four very important works of Russian literature, all but one found the way through Tamizdat. The first chapter is about Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which, as we all know, was published in the Soviet Union, but indeed Yasha justifies this opening by the fact that it really created the readership for Tamizdat. It really sort of broke the pathway from the Soviet Union to the West. Then follows the chapter about Akhmatova's Requiem, Chukovskaya's Sofia Petrovna, and finally about Shalamov's Kalima Tales. And the conclusion of the book is talking about Abram Terz, another very important figure for Tamizdat history, but Yasha there makes some kind of metaphorical, I would say, twist, focusing on Kentz as some kind of the symbolic figure for the Tamizdat author, or Tamizdat sort of the embodiment of Tamizdat in Kentz, which is the as we know, a human slash cacti from the outer space, living in the Soviet communal apartment and sort of living his memoirs, right? Of course, in the retelling it sounds absolutely crazy, but of course, those of you who read it knows that this is one of the best works of Russian literature written in the, I don't know, in the 20th century. So I'm not planning to retell the book, I'm planning to torture the author, and so I hope that he will enjoy it in this certain way. You produced the very important, very concise definition of Tamizdat as text that crossed the state border of the USSR twice, right? So I would like you to explain this definition in a little more words, but the essay question is the following: how unique is this phenomenon for Soviet history, Soviet literature, Soviet culture, right? Because we all can think about, you know, Joyce's Ulysses is published in Paris, right? Same happened with Lolita in the same press, right? Henry Miller. The reasons for this publication, Oscar Wilde, of course, the reasons for these publications were sort of moral censorship mainly, but we are living in the age when ethical issues or moral issues are definitely interpreted as political ones, right? So what is the difference between Joyce published in Paris and Shalamov published in Paris and elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, first thank you for the summary of the book that I would not have been able to give you myself. And the question is, of course, probably the most important one, thinking that Tamizdat, although it's just a Russian neologism, right? Its etymology is Russian. Tam means it's a preposition or indication of place, meaning of there, and this dat is kind of an abbreviation that we also see in Samizdat, meaning published, right? So published over there. The word is of Russian, not Slavic, not East European, Russian specifically etymology. But the phenomenon itself that it attempts to capture is, of course, by no means unique to not only Russian but Soviet or even East European, or even the Soviet. Kind of geographically, it's not unique to those lands, or rather, from where, right, those manuscripts were smuggled elsewhere. But it's also not unique, I would say, historically. For instance, today, there is, of course, a sort of reincarnation of Tamizdat in a sense, even though it's most of it, it's digital, right? I would say it is unique, though, to the print era, right? Today, I would not call Tamizdat, or only with very big reservations, because it's an entirely different phenomenon. So what took months, if not years, for a typical Tamizdat operation back in the days before internet, today can be done in a few clicks, right? And the consequences, of course, for that are also quite different. Not necessarily less, less serious, right? Can be more, perhaps, but it's just of a very different nature and mechanism. So opening it up as in some very distant and ideal future, Tamizdat project, I think, is ambitiously trying to kind of grow, right, into a Tamizdat project capturing very different geopolitical contexts. We do have one volunteer, for instance, who is embarking on Chinese Tamizdat. Even though the word may not exist, she hasn't been able to call it, right? As anything specific limited to just one word in Chinese, which is her native language, but nevertheless the phenomenon does exist and has existed. And Ukrainian Tamizdat would be called by a different name, but of course it is, in a sense, similar kind of from the inside. The inner workings of Tamizdat would not be much differ, even though the kind of composition of it, right, the spectrum of authors and others involved, would very often consist of entirely new names for obvious reasons, because it's a separate literature, right? But they do nevertheless intersect in many ways with agents of cultural production that I have tried to describe in my book about the Russian Tamizdat. One example from Polish context would be Yasha, for instance, who published, of course, predominantly Polish authors, but who was at the same time the first publisher of Terz, right, and many others.
You already partially answered my second question, which I wanted to answer then, but I'll rephrase it. So your argument is that although the book ends by the paragraph about today's condition created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and by the sort of surge of censorship and repression in Russia itself, that on the one hand the concept of Tamizdat is becoming relevant again, on the other hand you just said that it's not the same. It's not the same, and I understand what you mean, because really the stories you are telling about each of these texts shows that maybe in Marxist terms the sort of the added value of Tamizdat is produced by the difficulty and the time sort of that was invested into the process of smuggling the text abroad, just finding publishers, publishing, and smuggling it back into the Soviet Union, right? But of course now the very simplicity of the process of sending the text so far, right, doesn't create this added value. Is this the reason why Tamizdat is not feasible or is not relevant for this condition? On the other hand, another aspect of this question is that, based on your definition, Tamizdat is valuable as the part of, let's say, Soviet literature, right, or as the part of the literature where it came from, right? So, does it mean that you completely exclude from the world of Tamizdat literature that had been created in the emigration? So that's a methodological question.
Yes, thank you. Tamizdat has, well, it's a relatively new term, right, that I hope my book introduces more broadly just to scholarship, to ways of thinking about literary processes. I would say so far, if you ask not necessarily any random person, but a scholar or a former reader of Tamizdat, what Tamizdat means and what would you would include, right? Nearly everyone would say that, for instance, Brodsky after 1972, after his emigration to the US, would also be Tamizdat. But I understand kind of the riskiness and narrowness of the definition of Tamizdat I have proposed as texts that had to have crossed the border at least once on the way out as a manuscript, and to make the full kind of the cycle complete also across the same border on the way back as a publication, which is clearly not what happens with Ardis editions of Brodsky's poetry after he finds himself literally in the same basement from which Tamizdat was operating in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right? It is also not the same for Nabokov, even though Nabokov is hard to box into any definition, right? It is quite not the same for Georgy Adamovich, for Khodasevich upon his immigration, for Berberova, etc. So that counterpart for Tamizdat, however it's called, emigre literature, литература русского зарубежья, literature of the Russian abroad, right? Or as Gleb Struve, for instance, before the word Tamizdat really became recognizable, he would describe those books, right, that he himself would publish, having received the manuscripts or typescripts from inside the Soviet Union, he would refer to them as emigre books by non-emigre publishers, authors, I'm sorry, yeah. No. So it is a terminological problem that I decided to define as narrowly as possible, and it is simply not the same thing, even for an author like Akhmatova to be writing or not writing, only circulating it orally. For Requiem, right, knowing that it has no chance, right, of being published at least until after Ivan Denisovich plays Solzhenitsyn, when it was not published all the same, right, even though she did have the hopes. And for instance, for Nabokov, the author of Lolita, it only took, well, it's a book that was banned, of course, as we began saying earlier, but it is still quite not the same. Nabokov did count, right, on it being published, Lolita, while Akhmatova could hardly do so, writing Requiem in the 1930s as she was.
Yeah, in the 1930s I agree, but you're writing about 60s, 70s, predominantly 60s, right? And in the 60s, so then sort of a philosophical question. What was then the significance of publishing, say, Requiem abroad, if it could be circulating in Tamizdat in the 60s as other texts would? So Archipelago Gulag did circulate in Tamizdat while simultaneously being published in Tamizdat. And basically, I think that all of these texts more or less circulated in Tamizdat simultaneously with Tamizdat publication. So what was the point of that? On the other hand, of course, if there were, right, Tamizdat retypes, reprints, right, of say Lolita, right, that would be done from the Tamizdat publication. There were no other way to get a hold of the text. So what was the principal difference?
This is exactly where this third, right, third element of Soviet era literary culture comes in, namely Tamizdat. Of course, the absolute majority of Tamizdat publications, what became publications, at a certain point, after their manuscripts were found their way abroad, the absolute majority of them did circulate and were read first by authors inside the country and outside the country as Tamizdat, right? Except the difference is that Tamizdat is not a publication. It is.
Oh, that's debatable, I would say.
It opens many kind of even Foucauldian perspectives of what is a book, what's not a book, right? Of course. But if we speak, if we talk about the same phenomenon, right, of Tamizdat from the perspective of its audience, then it becomes a little bit easier because the audience, the readers of Tamizdat did, after all, consist of very limited, very narrow, and initiated readers. You had to have some special, even privileged, right, access to those circles where these manuscripts were disseminated. And that is very different from when it becomes a book and is freely, easily available from a library, from a bookstore.
Abroad.
Right. Of course, eventually, most Tamizdat publications did fuse back with Tamizdat because books are hard to smuggle back in, they're heavy. They're no longer on microfilms, they're no longer on Bible paper, even though, of course, this is a separate material phenomenon or sub-phenomenon of Tamizdat when they were published specifically for the sake of being smuggled back in as conveniently as possible. So the Gulag Archipelago, a 3-volume YMCA Press publication, it's a stack of books like this, right? Was almost simultaneously published as a pocket edition for tourists, exchange scholars to have better time smuggling back into the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and this leads me to another question. So you certainly know very many stories of manuscripts being smuggled abroad and books being smuggled into the Soviet Union. Which is your favorite, most adventurous story of this kind?
Abroad or back?
It doesn't matter.
Does.
Your pick. Tell us two.
Usually these, of course, would be different kind of assortments, right, of agents, people involved to smuggle something out and to smuggle it back as a publication. Some are more, I guess, anecdotal than others. Some are more secret than others. Some are also more kind of dramatic or even tragic than others. Well, I began my work on Tamizdat with Shalamov and with the manuscript of his Kolyma Tales, which I would say is one of, if not the most dramatic and kind of tragic, just because along the way it so happened that pretty much ceased being the author's text. It was serialized instead of being published as a standalone book, which is how it was written in the first place. It was also edited and even censored in Tamizdat, which makes it kind of, very often you could look at it as the mirror opposite, right, or reflection of Gossesdat, the state publishing house, notorious, right, for its censorship. Those things did happen in Tamizdat just as well, for the opposite ideological reasons, but very often for a similar kind of material extent, right, or effect. As for smuggling books back in, that is a much less researched, I would say, part of Tamizdat as a cultural institution, as a literary practice and political institution even. Those were kind of this round trip, right? The return journey of those texts as books were often facilitated by American and West European exchange scholars and graduate students, and sometimes undergraduate students too.
So they were not searched on the border? Right?
And diplomats.
And diplomats were not searched?
And so was diplomatic pouch, kind of untouchable. And even that had different degrees of untouchability. But foreign visitors to the Soviet Union, of course, were risking it, right? Even the proffers risked it. And of course, anyone like Nadezhda Mandelstam, who would meet with them very often, risked it too. And Shalamov, for instance, avoided such meetings because he knew what the camps were, and clearly, old as he was and sick, did not feel like risking it and ending up in those places for the second time, even though those, of course, were not the same camps, but nevertheless. One story that has to do with Requiem. What makes this fascinating and, in a sense, detective stories, each manuscript can be told as a detective story, right? So with Requiem, absolutely the central person there was Julian Oxman, who was a former prisoner in Kolyma.
And literary scholar. Right?
And a literary scholar, of course, from the older generation, kind of a friend of Tenyanov's, for instance. And Gleb Struve, who was a first-wave emigre, also quite a famous name, right, in Russian history and political history. But between them, there were quite a number of mediators, right, facilitators, including at the time in 1963 the cultural attaché of the US to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, who then became
Columbia
ambassador, Columbia graduate. Of course, I even asked him once if he would mind, right, telling the story of just his involvement with dispatching Tamizdat abroad. All he said was, these were fun times.
But you mentioned in passing that even Jakobson could have been involved in this, hiding under the pen as a pseudonym Yakovlev. Jakobson, Yakovlev, you know, it's pretty close if one starts looking. But he didn't want to announce his involvement.
I just want to name one more agent, kind of mediator or facilitator. This was an entire family of American academic family. Louis Foyer, Catherine Foyer, and their 15-year-old daughter, Robin Foyer Miller, who is today professor of Russian and comparative literature at Brandeis. And that is one of those, the most detective stories, perhaps, even though tragic as it was for Catherine Foyer, Robin's mother. So they were literally taken off the train going from Moscow via Leningrad to Helsinki and held at gunpoint and searched. Robin was 15, her mother realized that her notebook taken away could mean imprisonment for Oxman, who gave them the manuscript of Requiem. But the manuscript itself was not with them. It was had been dispatched by then by Matlock via the diplomatic pouch. So, and that circumstance the KGB may not even have known, right? When they decided to search their compartment and take them off the train at the border. So, yeah. How do we know all that, right? You might be wondering.
How do you know all that?
Well, first of all, archives. Second of all, of course, many of these people, like Robin, are around, and this is the time when many of them, realize that this is the time to tell this, especially, I guess, now, right, when Tamizdat is again a buzzword in the past year or so. And this is why we are, as Tamizdat project, we are also doing oral history.
That's very important. Yeah. But speaking about the things that may become known today, right? You write in the book that Tamizdat, the cultural institution, is sort of a joint project of immigration and Western state institutions, but you imply CIA. So basically, you're writing that with a few exceptions, or maybe just one, right? All Tamizdat presses were directly or indirectly funded by CIA. Do you have an access to this documentation now? There should be some time limit, right? So 50 years typically the open documents. Can you prove this? Do you see it? How was it done? Can we approach them now?
This is
They're not doing that kind of thing anymore. Actually, you've been told by somebody who approached CIA on finding current pro-Ukrainian operations in the literal world, and it's absolutely CIA is not the cultural institution that it was in the 60s, basically.
right.
So it probably doesn't. Yeah. So,
But
let's know how it was in the 60s, at least for history.
Yeah, the concept of soft power, of course, is very different today than it used to be, and very powerful weapon of the Cold War, right, or weapon on the cultural fronts of the Cold War, of course, were books, which they're not anymore because there is internet and other things. But in the 60s, you're right, it really becomes much more possible to find out and reconstruct is when, for instance, the archives of the Nobel Prize Committee open, and that's exactly what happened with the story of Dr. Zhevada by Pasternak, right? So there are scholars who are interested specifically, much more, I would say, than me, in those political kind of undercurrents, right, of Tamizdat publications, such as Ivan Tolstoy, journalist for Radio Free Europe, as opposed to Lazar Fleischmann, who is just a Pasternak literary scholar, and that was not necessarily his kind of top interest. But years passing, we also today have access, for instance, to the archive and notebooks of someone called George Minden. It's at the Hoover Institution Archives. It's several notebooks containing addresses, and sometimes phone numbers of sailors from Poland, of just border patrol people, of ordinary citizens living in villages and towns on the borders, let's say between Eastern and Western Europe. And also records of such operations as dropping books into the Baltic Sea just for the sake of fishermen fishing a book and taking it home just out of curiosity and maybe reading it. And if that happened, that was considered by the CIA already a huge success, regardless of what they would kind of get, right, from the.
So the percent of loss would be zero.
Yes, it's a very expensive operation, but books are also cheaper. I mean, none of those books were $40 as this one is. And they were.
They will be paid.
I would love to see it swimming in the Baltic Sea.
Yeah, we do. So let's imagine.
But what made it possible, of course, was funding. But what the CIA would very often do, they would simply buy the printer. And there was a place on Park Avenue in New York, where a woman whose name is Veronica Stein sat. And I mean, by now we can name those people. And would just give free copies of Tamizdat to anyone who presented her with a ticket to the Soviet Union. Any tourist, any student. Here is a book, take it with you.
But how would people know? Just word of the mouth?
Yeah.
It wasn't published in New York Times, right? So please come and pick it up.
No. Most of these places had some covered kind of names, and sometimes these would be entire publishing houses created, like half fake, but you would see this name on the title pages. They would only publish one book, and that's it. There is no further trace of such a publisher anymore. So these were kind of pop-up presses, pop-up centers. Yeah, imagine something this today, it's hardly possible even to imagine it.
Maybe excessive, right? But nevertheless, my father told me how he read Khrushchev's secret speech in 19... As you know, it was called secret, not just for the beauty of it. It was secret in the Soviet Union. It was not published. But he was a student in the collective farm in Moldova, current Moldova, and there were parachutes sent with the printouts from across the border. For some reason from Romania, which was also a socialist country, but it was more available from there. And so that's how he sort of got familiarized with the main document of the period.
This specific operation is in the notebooks of George Minden.
Really?
Romania was the country where books and leaflets, sometimes not just books, something like leaflets, would be dropped off from the airplanes, which was not possible over the territory of the Soviet Union for more securely guarded the sky. But Romania was that country, yes.
Right, so you can see it's the source for multiple movies and adventures. Just a second, I'll ask two more questions. We'll open the floor for all the questions in the book. Right?
Yeah.
So I have a boring literary scholarship question, but very scrummy. You already mentioned Shalamov, and I think that this chapter on Shalamov is the most sensational part of your book, and no wonder it was sort of published in Russia in the shortened version in Kolta and then elsewhere. So basically what Yasha shows is that, as he mentioned, that Roman Gul predominantly, but some other emigre literati, publishers, editors, they considered Shalamov's texts to be badly written. And they were editing them according to their idea of the good style. And this good style, surprisingly, made this text very much similar to Solzhenitsyn. And similar, so basically the book begins with, as I said already, with the analysis of reactions to Solzhenitsyn's text abroad, and not only sort of in the proper West, but in the socialist West, right, so Eastern Europe. And basically Yasha arrives to a strange conclusion, which resonates with what he writes later about Shalamov in the last chapter, that Solzhenitsyn's success, huge success, tremendous success, is explained not only by the fact that it was the first text, it wasn't the first literary text, but the first literary text of this scope and about Gulag, but because it was written in the socialist realist style, because it was accessible not only to the Soviet readership. Apparently, socialist realism is the very, very broad highway that sort of connects with the any kind of readership, right? And this explains this basically maiming of Shalamov's text by Roman Gul and others who were actually in their editorial efforts, they were removing all this avant-garde and experimental aspects of Shalamov's prose that now we sort of look closely at, right? So how do you explain this strange paradox? So these texts were pushed away from the Soviet Union because they conflicted with socialist realism, but apparently the sort of dominant aesthetic, it was not censorship, but in Shalamov's case it was censorship, right? Taste was similar, was expecting something that they couldn't produce exactly because they were trying to go away from socialist realist requirement.
This is something that Andrei Sinyavsky / aka Abram Terz explained in his essay Dissidence as my personal experience, Dissidentство как личный опыт, where he says that his disagreements with the Soviet regime were mainly stylistic. This also brings to mind this.
You said that he said this half jokingly.
Well, you never know. That's why I said it.
That's what you wrote, you know.
But was this Brodsky or Dovlatov who said Soviet, anti-Soviet, it's all the same.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Dovlatov had this.
Dovlatov. It's all the same stylistically. That is precisely why Solzhenitsyn, who was taken up, right, as this idol, right, for the dissident movement and everything anti-Soviet, was stylistically and biographically a Soviet author. And that's how he wrote, and that's perhaps the only way he could write, being a product of Soviet culture, right? What happens with the first wave of emigration, such as Gul, Roman Gul, who emigrated in 1920, not everybody, of course, but they were, first of all, many of them were not writers at all, right? It is emigration somehow that makes a writer out of pretty much anybody, right? It is a field trip for a psychoanalyst what happens, but nearly half, I would say, if not more, no one counts, of emigre poets became poets after emigrating and had very different careers before. So Gul was the military man really, and he was participant of the white movement.
Yeah, you can say the same about Tolstoy also, just an officer. with the unfinished university education.
That's true. Well, yeah, let's not compare, but you can.
There's no such a profession, sort of that people, except for literary institute, of course.
What I want to add about Gul, and Tolstoy helps here, is that they were very much products of, strange as it may sound, of the realist tradition, right? Somehow having skipped, the avant-garde, the Silver Age, the symbolism, acmeism, futurism, or futures was for them very often anathema, just because of its kind of association with the Soviet movements.
So that's the key, sort of the skipping of modernist legacy, right? Sort of trying to create it directly from realist legacy, as if nothing happened in between. Right?
And this is exactly what socialist realism, let's not forget it's called realism, socialist or not, right? Claim to derive from, right? Claim to, of course. That's a very important disclaimer, that it claimed to depart from high realism of the 19th century. Which it had very little, of course, in common with. But it was realism nevertheless. It was defined, as we know, as a truthful and historically concrete representation of reality in its revolutionary development in the 30s, but it was about the representation of reality, however untruthful or truthful, that was a whole other kind of different question in a sense. And Shalamov did not write as a realist, despite the hyper-realist or naturalistic, right, import of his Kalema short stories. It is not realism, it is kind of a revival of modernism of the 20s, 50 years or so later. And that was inaccessible very often to emigre critics, for whom, in a sense, this Soviet literature, right, had been frozen since, and language, by the way, since their emigration in the 20s. They could not even witness the development of the literary and simply linguistic transformations, right? Which, by the way, still happens.
Yeah. So my last question, right? So you mentioned that the most, for me, very interesting aspect of your book was the chronology, where when you write that sort of 2 weeks after the publication of Solzhenitsyn's Vanya Denisovich Akhmatova sort of puts Requiem on paper, finally sort of dictates and type it, etc., and how all these things were happening almost simultaneously. It was very, very nicely packed, and that indeed Solzhenitsyn opened the I don't know, as I said, pathway, but not only for the West, but also for those who were sort of not even thinking about publishing type that they had. But maybe from today's very, very distorting perspective, when one places Ivan Denisovich next to Sofia Petrovna's, Chukovskaya's Sofia Petrovna, or even Akhmatova's Requiem, it is really very hard to fathom and understand why Solzhenitsyn could have been published and Requiem and Sofia Petrovna could not. And you show the history, and there are multiple little factors and etc. But it is impossible, in my view, and you correct me, to grasp some kind of the political or even political censorship, some logic in the censorship. Why this text was published and the other one was not, right? So what was the big difference between them?
There were several, of course, factors. One was gender. It was, as we kind of know, and not only in the Soviet Union. It was very much men's business, right, to write and publish books. So in Solzhenitsyn's case, it's both the author and the protagonist, right, who are both male and kind of ordinary, if not peasant or soldier
Former
characters,
peasant, right? He's a woman.
And this is, in a sense, the opposite, well, not in a sense, but literally the opposite, or biologically the opposite, for both Akhmatova and Chukovskaya. Akhmatova's speaker, right, in her, or speakers, several, in Requiem are the wives and the mothers, right? And so is Akhmatova herself. I mean, look, they're all relatively autobiographical, right, works. For Solzhenitsyn, it's of course fiction, but it's very often taken autobiographically. And so it was for Akhmatov. For Chukovskaya, it was Chukovskaya's gender as the author. But so Sofia Petrovna, the protagonist, except in Chukovskaya's case, in Sofia Petrovna, the author and the protagonist, both female, of course, they are kind of divorced from each other because Sofia Petrovna, unlike, or as almost the mere opposite of her author, is a simple woman, right? But simple, not as
She's not very simple.
well, not as simple as Ivan Denisovich in Solzhenitsyn. She is, as Chukovskaya defines her, half intelligentsia, polu-intelligentka. But even more importantly, this is not a success story, as socialist realism usually wants us, right?
So it's more distant from socialist realism, it's less open for the adoption, right? So,
well, it's a story of a downfall and not of an ascent.
Complete downfall, right?
Solzhenitsyn's here where this is where it becomes all these slips of the tongue. Solzhenitsyn's day, I want to say, right? The day of Ivan Denisovich, of course, ends on a rather optimistic note. Of course, it's very utopian.
3,650 days, right? No, the 60 days, right? Because of the leap years to the 3 more days, right?
But it does literally say that it was an almost happy day.
It's ironic, I would say. But okay, yeah, I see what you mean. I see what you mean, right?
It's a technique to, well, it's kind of the payoff, right? He writes it for the censor to kind of pass it,
You
right?
think so? No, I think it's very sarcastic. You're right about this, how the most important justification is the scene of building of the wall, how he gets excited with this sort of labor.
So it's not entirely incorrect
Yeah.
to say that Ivan Denisovich did find some happiness in physical labor, slave as he was in Stalin's camp. And Chukovskaya Sofia Petrovna loses her mind and burns the manuscript. The only manuscript, a letter.
The letter from the son. The plea for help.
Yeah. So that's the whole difference. One is the story of kind of upward throughout, from the very beginning, from 5 a.m. until the end of the day, and the other has two slopes. The resulting kind of trajectory being downward.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Yasha, and I'm happy to open the floor for questions, please.
Yes, if I may ask you a question. Is there any information of all the authors of Tamizdat who were not sent abroad, who were caught by the authorities, sent to Gulag for a certain number of years, and what happened to those Tamizdat documents? Is there any information of it? Were they all lost? Or some of them were recovered afterwards? Not abroad, but locally.
Well, it is not, these are not the same categories, I would say. Samizdat and authors who were imprisoned. You did not have to be an author at all to be sent to a camp, and you could be an author and never, Samizdat author and never be imprisoned. Chukovskaya wasn't, not even Akhmatova, right?
I know one of such stories about, but it's not exactly what you're asking about. There was this famous, later in the 60s, writer, he began as a writer early, Yuri Dombrovsky, who spent 17 years in Gulag, very much like Shalomov. And before, or actually between his two of his Gulag terms, he wrote the novel about Nazi Germany. How was it? The day of returns for its skull. Right. It was very much Azopian language because it was basically describing the assault of scientists, of anthropologists, right, by the Nazi official anthropology. Right? So this novel was confiscated when he was arrested again, and then he was released in the late 50s. And the legend goes, Yasha, correct me, I don't know how this legend is described, that at certain points some person showed up at his door and brought him the bag with papers. When he opened this bag, it was this novel. So either this person just smuggled it from KGB archive, or it was the form of sort of hand it back, we didn't find anything criminal. It was published later. So that's the story that I know. So this recovered manuscripts. I don't know if it circulated in Samizdat though. Обезьяна. So his novel, the sort of Факультет ненужных вещей, the School of Unnecessary Things, it was published in Paris and then circulated, right? But not this one.
Yeah, so Haben sua fata libelli, right? Little books have their own fates, and each one is probably different.
Anybody looked yet at Radio Liberty literary broadcast, the sort of equivalent of Tamizdat audiobook? Because I was on the receiving end with that as a teenager, and it's really open, big list of names and books, and there was a number of brokers starting from Shepka and Zamyatin and on into Solzhenitsyn and
Thank you. Yes, of course, my book is about printed publications in print, but most of them were first broadcast through enemies' voices, right? Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, BBC. And that's how a radio wave is just much more powerful because you can't intercept it. Well, you can jam it, right? But it's not a physical thing that you can destroy, as it often happened, right? So these were, of course, operations of the Western secret services very often, most often.
Sure.
Funded.
The Congress, funded by the Congress, as we know.
So it was just on a whole different, much larger scale, of course. And then you ask if has anyone written about
researched it, looked at it,
yes.
etc.
There are at least several books about, sometimes about all of them together, sometimes about just Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty, as a kind of echo chamber of Samizdat. That's the term that Jessie Labov uses, for example, in her chapter in this Tamizdat, Samizdat and Beyond, this collection of, very good collection of articles, the echo chamber.
But that would be a great extension for Tamizdat project, to have audio books. Probably you can get the rights to reproduce these recordings, and so people can download them and listen to sort of returning to childhood in many ways, right? And these readings were very powerful, of course.
what makes it very idiosyncratic, especially today, and the more the time passes, right, is that these were works by Soviet authors, such as Shalamov or Trotsky, read by emigres in this very much pre-Soviet, pre-revolutionary pronunciation, enunciation, intonations, and yeah, this is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, they sounded very different, indeed.
Yeah, well, first of all, I've been in progress in your book, so I apologize if this question is already answered later on. But it occurred to me reading the first chapter about Solzhenitsyn and the introduction that if the Tamizdat publishing houses were often, ironically, a mirror image, with the exception of artists, of Socialist in terms of also having an ideological sort of agenda and censorship sort of in that sense as well, reading the first chapter and your argument, from what I understood, that Solzhenitsyn was intentionally following the socialist realism model in some ways in order to get published at home, was there the flip side as well of authors writing in the Soviet Union with the idea that their work might be published in Tamizdat and trying to conform it to the taste,
Western.
yes, to the Western either tastes or their ideas of what might get published in the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very kind of the counterpart
Yeah.
of the Soviet author's strategy, right? To conform. The opposite of that, if I may rephrase what you said, is kind of deliberately depart as far as possible from the Soviet mandate, right, and make it more marketable, if you'd like, for in the West abroad. Aksionov.
Oh, no, the girl.
Sure, but that is later. I would say.
79, right?
Well, yeah, that was before he immigrated, certainly. But someone like Davlatov, it was. I wouldn't say it was like his consumerism or something. He simply absorbed, right, and internalized a lot of Hemingway and Kurt Vonnegut, right, while still living in Leningrad.
But that happened with a lot of people.
True.
I mean, there were people who lived Hemingway.
Sure. And Faulkner and, yeah.
That's why people immediately published in Soviet Union the way they wrote. I mean, you open 60s and here, boom, 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 Hemingway was like immediately translated. You know.
Hemingway was, but was this still kind of publishable in the Soviet Union? What Davlatov wrote not a la Hemingway, of course, but still in the Russian language after all, right? I would say it read as foreign, non-Russian literature in a sense.
But then that also begs the question of what, sort of the balance between what's internalized versus what's intentional strategy, because by the same token, Solzhenitsyn could have internalized rather than strategized
Oh, yes,
about all of
absolutely.
the socialist realism.
Absolutely, it was both, always a combination, because what else could he have internalized if not Soviet literature?
I mean, he read some other stuff, I guess.
Well, yeah, but
Not that one.
it is.
In the 30s, when he wasn't in the fleet.
It is easier to talk along these lines about political samizdat and tamizdat, something that our colleague Sergei Ushakin from Princeton wrote about early on, really the foundational article of his called "The Terrifying Mimicry of Samizdat," where he suggests, right, that anti-Soviet political samizdat was, again, stylistically very much Soviet, and that was both kind of the blessing and the curse of the dissident movement, because what other language could they have used? They did not have a different language, on the one hand. On the other hand, they wanted to talk to the Soviet regime in its own language, in the language of its constitution, which they tried the Soviet Union to make observe. So I would say something similar with works of literature, except here you really never know. what is intentional, deliberate, what's not. This is neuroscientists perhaps might know it if they analyze the brain of Solzhenitsyn someday. But
The living brain.
yeah, it has to be the living brain to see the poetic function, right?
Two sort of questions or comments about the juxtaposition in a way
Louder, please.
between Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov, a Russian exiled artist who's spent quite a lot of time in jails here and there, and in part in connection has read both extensively, says that for him the major difference is that Solzhenitsyn has no sense of humor and Shalamov does. Do you find any use to that?
Yeah, it is very hard to imagine someone giggling as they
Well,
read
there-
Shalamov, but he does. It is kind of situational humor, almost bordering on the absurd, of course,
Yeah,
given how just detached from reality, from the conventions, right, and norms, that reality he's describing was, like his short story Injector. The Injector. Not the Injector, Injector, which someone took for the last name of the camp guard, I think. That is his humor, but it's almost Brechtian.
But
So-
Solzhenitsyn has a sense of humor. I would defend him. If you remember the first shock of Kruger Первом, there is this famous scene when the inmates of Sharashko, this research institute behind the barbed wire, they staged the trial of Prince Igor from the word of Igor's campaign as the traitor. So they're using the Soviet language sort of in parodical. So it can be read as a postmodernist text if one tries hard. So nobody did, but
and the other thing I wanted to, I'm not sure I should bring up, but since we were spent so much time talking about the CIA, on the other side, I believe that Tamizdat, like Samizdat, was also used to compromise people inside Russia on many occasions.
Oh yeah, of course.
So there's that sort of counterpart too.
In a sense, it could be even much more dangerous than Samizdat. Because
Yes, I'm not sure what the balance is, but the certain examples I know of, I
Was-
think of Tamizdat.
was different across different Tamizdat ventures. So there was one in particular, Grani, the journal Grani, and the publishing house Pasev. It was pretty well known to the Soviet authorities, to the KGB and the Soviet Writers Union, and everyone else, that it was in fact funded by the CIA via this organization called NTS, National Alliance of Russian Solidarists, which was just the most onerous anti-Soviet aiming ray organization. Also partly because of its kind of affiliation with fascism, or so it was claimed at least, right, by the KGB. It's, but for instance, when Shalamov writes his famous letter of renunciation, right, of the foreign Tamizdat publications of Kolyma Tales, he clearly mentions Pasev and Grani and Novy Journal, but he doesn't really mention any kind of book-length editions that had already existed and translations into foreign languages. When Akhmatova's Requiem is published as a book in '63 by a very small publishing house in Munich called Товарищество зарубежных писателей, nothing. But when her Requiem is published by Grani, she is visited by, ironically, Granin. I'm not inventing, that's really how ironically it happened, Granin comes to Akhmatova to talk about the publication of Requiem in Grani, and warns her that she was about to go to Oxford and that she should behave.
May I ask you, how come Solzhenitsyn was allowed to go back? After living in Vermont, in a farm for so long, suddenly he
Well, it
really...
was 94 when he went back, and it's another thing, how come did he allow himself to be honored by Putin once he was back? That's another question. But to go back in 94, many people did. Aksionov did.
Really?
Vainovich, of course. Yeah.
Stop.
Quick short comment that will hopefully turn into a question. So one of the most important Tamizdat, Ukrainian Tamizdat book that was published is an anthology edited by Yuri Lavrinenko called "Прострелянный ветром," the executive Renaissance. It was initiated in Paris by Yasha, published by his publishing house, but edited here in Europe by Yuri Lavrinenko. And he was, among other things, he was rushing the editor because he wanted the book to be published in a pocket book format, so it could be brought to Vienna, where there would have been a festival which is going to be attended by participants from Soviet Ukraine. And that was one of the ways how the book could have been distributed. And indeed, was one of the ways how the book ended up in Ukraine, started to be read, and the authorities had to somehow react to this, and the cleverest reaction was, of course, to write a negative review, which was a total success for a book that was kind of implemented in the West. What was the reaction to Russian Tamizdat editions that were published in the West? What was the reaction from the official literary scholarship or literary criticism? Because, for example, sometimes there was a case when a collection of poems by Bogdan Igor Antonich was published here, and the next year an edition appeared in Soviet Ukraine. So that was a way of responding to Tamizdat processes taking place in the West. So what was perhaps
we are actually adding this new rubric or category to the Tamizdat project website, which will say in Gossesdat, which will trace precisely these reactions of the Soviet literary establishment to the anti-Soviet literary establishment. So very often they were, I would say most often they were ignored. Nothing happened, right? Akhmatova's Requiem was completely ignored, the book edition. Shalamov's Kolyma Tales would have been ignored had it not been used. Well, he needed to become to be a member of the Soviet Writers' Union, and that is the only reason why it was brought up, and he had to write this letter. Or didn't have to, but wrote. But for instance, there were Tamizdat, Contraband, pirate publications of someone like Twardowski, the person who published Solzhenitsyn. His Vasily Terkin in the Other World was first published in Tamizdat, and he was, of course, infuriated. He had to write a very negative review of his own work published in Tamizdat. You can imagine this. And, of course, claimed that he never had anything to do with it, which he didn't.
But he wrote.
But he didn't give the manuscript to a foreigner, to the best of our knowledge, but maybe he did. So we'll see. But yeah, sometimes it was one and the same person. It was a Tamizdat author and the Soviet higher up, right?
Yes,
Please.
thank you. Ilya Levkov, Liberty Publishing. You touched a couple of times the issue how the dissident and those who utilize still the Soviet new language in order, for various reasons. But it's not only the language, it's also, and somebody should trace it on their perception and culture of analysis, because they were so-called followers, I wouldn't say enslaved to that language, but language, even Marxist, non-Marxist, it's really material and it's part of the conscious and subconscious. A case in point that which I witnessed, that office that you mentioned where Veronika Steinborg, she was a secondary or third person there. The first one, as a matter of fact, in charge of this operation was a fellow from Romania. Back to the books from Romania to them. And I received the manuscript from Alexander Yanov, Ruskaya Ideya, you might have. And I spoke to her, I knew her before she got this job, and I mentioned it, and she told me, no, I will not consider to purchase this book from you. I said, any specific reason? She says, yes. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is against. So here you have a boomerang that comes and comes on the third wave back to this, where person in charge speaks that language, but not only speaks that language, also comments, and as we all know, she was relative of Solzhenitsyn's first wife.
This is why, to me, Tamizdat is above all an institution, right? As an institution, an institution does not exist without a hierarchy. And as long as there is like institutional hierarchy, there are ideological agendas, right? And Solzhenitsyn was very much part of it. Speaking of Shalamov again, of course, it was not just the fact that they emigres like Gul were, well, it's a matter of taste. You may not like Shalamov as a writer, but of course there was also Solzhenitsyn who had to remain right on the pedestal, had to remain the one kind of focal point of the emigres and the dissidents' kind of faith, right, in the anti-Soviet movement. And Shalamov did not come in kind of handy here because he would simply make the concentration of this faith smaller, right, or less concentrated. I think we had a question here, and then Natasha.
So I wanted to ask, in the introduction you talked about, when you talked about the history of Tamizdat, you talked about Herzen and how he was kind of like enriched by his relationship with the Polish community abroad and kind of inspired by that. And so I wanted to ask, were there any kind of equivalents of that with Tamizdat publishing, where, like, what was the relationship like between Russian publishing abroad and other Eastern European immigrant communities outside of Eastern Europe?
Thank you. Actually, this Polish participation, or on the contrary, Russian participation in the Polish Tamizdat, or however you call it, is at least a century old, right? So it did begin with Herzen, who was an exile from Tsarist Russia, and who adopted the slogan "Za nasza I wasza wolność" from the Polish rebels of the 1830s. Some 30 years later, it became the slogan of Herzen's Free Russian Press, based in London. What happened a century later, right? In August 1968, as we just discussed it with Pavel Litvinov, right, who is the only who is still alive out of the 7 people who walked out onto the Red Square on August 25th, 68, their slogan was the same with the inverted order of pronouns. It was not for our freedom and yours, as was initially the Polish slogan and then Herzen's, but for your freedom and ours. За вашу и нашу свободу, right? That idea belonged to Gorbanevskaya, and Litvinov claims he did not even notice it, that the pronouns, possessive pronouns, were inverted. So that happened. The demonstration, of course, was inside the Soviet. Outside the Soviet Union, Herzen's name was kind of both the object of nostalgia and frustration, because romanticization, century before, it all seemed much more cleaner, right, and more romantic than it was in reality in the 1960s. But I would say Jerzy Gedroic is this figure who mediated almost all the connections, no, a lot of the connections between Russian, Polish, but also other East European, Ukrainian, of course, yes. Influx of manuscripts. Another one was a very important publishing house called Overseas Publications Interchange, based again in London, where the Polonia, the Polish diaspora, was more, I guess, traditional Polish diaspora than Gedroic affiliated with. So they would publish first books about the Solidarity movement in the early 80s, and other mainly Polish-related themes, but also books about the Czech context and etc. So it was a transnational phenomenon, Tamizdat, and makes it all the more kind of organic for us as Tamizdat project to trace points of these intersections. With Gedroic, for instance, as an example, being a point of intersection between different literary traditions and cultures and languages.
So I wanted to ask if I understand correctly the relationships between the author and Tamizdat publications had a very different range. Some of them would give the manuscript, like Pasternak and would say, publish, and some of them go, no, I don't want to do it, like someone like Trifonov, whose novel was published only after his death, and he didn't want to do it even when he was here in the United States. So I was wondering, since all this publication system existed in the Western world, what was the copyright background for the publication of books in general, and did Tamizdat exist as a kind of an island in this world, or they had some legal systems around it?
90%, if not more, of it was piracy. Part of the reason was that the Soviet Union did not join the Copyright Convention until 1973. So anyone could do what they pleased, pretty much, with texts and the translations from these texts into foreign languages. But even in 73, it didn't change much, because the copyright Mark is much more knowledgeable expert on that. Who did the copyright in fact belong to? Didn't it belong
to VAP?
Right, so to the state essentially, not to individual authors.
No, there was a contract between VAP and the author.
There was a contract, right. But the royalties, for example, if copyright is essentially about money, right, it's an economic kind of tool, then it was of very little use even if you indicated whose copyright it was. Purely symbolic. So some did, artists tried to make sure that they actually have a contract with every author signed. But someone like Pasiev, of course, wouldn't, because imagine indicating the author's copyright on the title page or wherever it's indicated of an edition that is whose publisher is considered the greatest enemy of the Soviet. This would only incriminate the author inside the country much more. So at least this way the author could claim piracy never gave them the manuscript, they did it themselves without my knowledge or consent, right? That was almost invariably a disclaimer. The manuscript has been received from the Soviet Union via an intermediary. We are publishing this text without the author's knowledge or consent. That is exactly what it said on Shalamov's publications in Novy Journal, even though the editor knew perfectly well that Shalamov himself gave this manuscript to the smuggler.
But some of them were sincerely unhappy, like Brodsky about his very
But again, copyright is a very... There was no common system, right, for the Western and the Soviet to even establish copyright and that sort of relationship between the publisher and the author.
It's a little bit like trying to discuss copyright on Tamizdat. You know, it's kind of absurd idea by definition. You know.
Well, Tamizdat was not commercial, right? Of course, there was
It was commercial, actually, very, very much commercial in some cases, because people actually
black market.
buy and sold,
Sure.
produced it and sold it, and and there's some people who live from that. Not too many, but some, at least in Moscow. I don't know about other places.
True. But Tamizdat is...
And also the Tamizdat from Tamizdat.
Yeah.
When you take Shalamov's and retype it, and it goes into Tamizdat, what was kind of the goal, what kind of copyright could be.
As Yasha mentioned, artists, and we know artists, but artists had basically their feeder were books translated to English. And among these books were Trifonov, Zaligin, who else? Nagibin. So very, very proper Soviet writers, and obviously these publications were absolutely legit in terms of copyright.
But the main kind of fuel of Ardis's success was a Russian language edition. Kopelev, whose exclusive rights, worldwide rights, right, they managed to obtain. So every translation of Kopelev's to be preserved forever, Ardis benefited from every edition. That did not really happen very often. The Gulag Archipelago was, of course, a smash hit and the bestseller. But the royalties that Solzhenitsyn received, he was already, it happened simultaneously, right, between his exile and publication of the Gulag Archipelago, but it was enough for him to establish the foundation for helping political prisoners.
Yeah, actually it was the first spark that of this disintegration of the Soviet Union. This was the demand and receiving the right from Lithuanians, ask VAP to leave the VAP and establish their own Litva. So, which points out their importance, and they knew that they could try it without beginning the rough response from the Soviet Union itself. They found a nice spot.
Last student question.
Reading also in the first chapter, the little section about myth making and spirals, I kind of got the thought that if, according to your definition, a successful Tamizdat manuscript has to make the round trip, it's not really a round trip per se, because as it goes back, it acquires more participants, smugglers, editors, an increased audience and everything. And that made me think that it's at least one loop of a spiral itself. All of them is that. Would you agree with that? And if not, what is the shape of a star?
Trajectory.
Yeah.
Three-dimensional.
The shape of Tamizdat